Okay, so I'm going to give a kind of a mixed answer here because I was kind of an unusual case. I will say I'm very surprised how few doctoral students wind up doing Fulbright because you'd figure that they have a lot more leeway and freedom to move around, but almost all the Fulbright recipients in the German group were undergrads. And the life of an undergraduate student in Germany is very different than the life of a doctoral student. Bachelor students are expected to go to classes full-time, and because Germany is a little bit hierarchical in the academic world, you don't have a social life with your professor. A doctoral student is exactly the opposite. You don't have any classes at all. You're expected to spend all your time in open research, and you do usually have a social life with your professor. So you and your other laboratory mates and maybe even your professor go out and have beers and things like that in the evening. So my social circle and my academic circle were exactly the same thing. I had a variety of German friends and other multinational friends because, I mean, EU is open borders, so anybody from any of the other EU states could go to a German university. So my lab group had 17 people, 6 of whom were actually Germans. The rest of them were Dutch, Belgian, Spanish, French, British, and me. So we had a variety of languages, and everybody was always making fun of everybody else's nations and things like that. So that was fun. I also was the first person to go to my host city in, they told me, 17 years. Most people who go to Germany go to one of 4 cities, and a lot of the Fulbright students in those cities tend to make sort of little amoeboid buddy groups with them. With each other. So I will say my social circle was very integrated with my academic circle, but I found that for a lot of my fellow students that wasn't necessarily the case, so I think it kind of boils down to your own initiative, how much you want to actually try to communicate with your fellow classmates, how much you want to meet with each other outside of work, or if you're the type of person for whom work life and social life are basically the same life. But that was my POV, for what it's worth.
I'm going to answer this question twofold. I'm going to say first and foremost, remember that when you're going through the Fulbright process, when you get to the country that you're going to, you're not going there to travel, you're actually going to be living there. So there's a very different experience of, I'm on vacation in Spain, and I live in Spain, and dealing with the bureaucratic process. If you think the DMV is bad, oh. But so for me, I think also a unique experience I had even within the Fulbright world. So I got my master's at the Instituto de Empresa, which is an institution that all of our classes, all of our programs were actually in English. So I really didn't get to communicate the way that I wanted to with the Spanish population because everybody was fascinated with the Americans about speaking English. I was there when the presidential election was going on, so that perspective was completely different than what we were getting here in the States. But I was dealing with, on a daily basis, working with 30 different nationalities every day. And to Miss Chambers' point about this diversity, we all talk about, yes, I like diversity, yes, I want to work in diversity. But it's very different when you're actually in a group working with someone from Colombia, someone from India, someone from Tanzania, from America, from Iran, and you put them together and you get very different results, and sometimes it's extraordinarily frustrating. You know, like the Italian will say one thing, then the German gets mad, and if you think political science classes here or political debates here get rough, imagine being in a class about globalization and you have a Syrian, a German, an American, and a British person. It brings a very interesting perspective. So the way that I interacted with the Spanish population, I went out of my way when I wasn't in school. I mean, I was there when the Catalan uprising recently that just happened, I was there. So I was talking to a lot of people from Madrid, and they were saying, yeah, we don't understand people from Barcelona, they're like this. And people from San Sebastian and the Basque Country, they all had very different perspectives. So one of the things that I think also from Spain that I got, one of the best lessons, was also my interaction with Latin America. So there's a lot of Latin Americans that live in Spain, and because they have a lot of more freedoms due to Spanish colonialism, in the past. And so I met a lot of, especially like Venezuelans, people from Honduras, people from Colombia, people who had a lot of repressions in their country. And I learned a lot about how, similarities from where I'm from Iran. And I mean, I think this is what Senator Fulbright really wanted to showcase. It's not about you having tapas and wines, which yes, it is a little bit about that, but it's not about having, drinks and socializing or studying. I think the most important aspect of the Fulbright program is that it gives you an entryway to new cultures, new ideas, and perspectives. And so it was very interesting for me to see how people would say, maybe you guys got this as well, as you Americans in your air conditioning, you Americans and this, and this, and this. And it was very interesting in classes when we would say, well, this is how we think of Europeans, and they would say, we're not Europeans, we're Spanish, we're English. So the long story short of it is the commissions that you work with. I mean, the Spanish commission was phenomenal. I would run to them. I used to run to Miss Chambers all the time. Miss Chambers, what do I do? I would do the same thing with the Spanish commission, and they were phenomenal to work with. Well, I hope that answers your question.
Elizabeth and Holly, did you want to have any comments too, as far as sort of what you experienced in your countries, the Americans versus the Indians, or Americans versus Europeans or Germans, if you had sort of any similar or different experiences?
Sure. Where do you even want to start? I will say my laboratory mates in Germany, and I found out later after the fact, on the first day that I arrived, we all went out to dinner at a pub near the university, and I found out after the fact that they had all taken bets on whether or not I would be smart enough to order proper water, because in Germany, in the United States, when you go to a restaurant and you order water, you get tap water in a glass and it's free. If you go to a restaurant in Germany, you get carbonated bottled water, and it costs more than beer. So it turns out that they had all taken bets on whether I would be clever enough to figure that out. So they certainly, I will say, they certainly do have their stereotypes. But like I said, the group that I happened to be working with, the micropaleontology group, was extremely multinational. We communicated in equal parts German, English, and Dutch, because those were the three major dominant languages. But at any point in time, you could hear you'd hear something whirring in the lab. You'd hear Portuguese swear words come flying at you. Say, "Oh, Andrea's having a bad day." So most of the time, everybody was working very cohesively and just doing their sort of thing. But I mean, on downtime and lunch breaks and things like that, there was a lot of mostly good-natured ribbing, especially between the Germans and the French. I was there during the absolute mushroom period of the European migrant crisis, and there was a migrant camp about a kilometer from campus, and I will say there were some very diverse opinions about that within my group. I think because I had studied at that lab before for 3 months during an internship, they already kind of knew me. They knew I wasn't going to say anything completely embarrassing in front of them, so I never got that much rib for being one of those Americans. But I suppose it's a case-by-case basis.
I think one thing that I found quite quickly and I found quite refreshing was that most people I encountered in India were very good at differentiating between what the American government might do and might think and what people from the United States might do and might think, and realizing that those two things might not always be identical. I think that was also particularly useful at the time that I was there, because it was early in my Fulbright days that George W. Bush was elected for the first time, and you might remember how fraught that election process was, and there were lots of opinions from people in India about how we should have managed that process and who should be making the judgments and the outcome of that, and how, you know, India's democratic example could be of use in the United States for sorting out the mess of the election. But I also learned, you know, that people were quite curious about American cultural practices, which I was often called upon to sort of reflect on or talk about. And I thought that that was a very useful, reflective kind of learning experience. And, you know, sometimes kind of aggressively, like, why do you Americans put your old people in nursing homes? What's wrong with you? Why don't you keep them with you and care for them, you know, until they die forever? And you know, also ideas like, how can you go away from your family to study? Don't you love them? You Americans, you don't love your families. So those kinds of experiences, I think, were really, really helpful for getting, you know, not only learning about a new culture and absorbing new experiences, but also reflecting on where I had come from and how other folks in the world might see the place where I'd come from.
Probably the biggest joke I got was this happened with multiple people in multiple circles. Apparently we have a terrible stereotype in Central Europe for all speaking with something that I can only describe as caricatured Texan accents. So I had multiple people in Germany come up to me and ask me whether I cultivated an accent to sound non-American, and then they do some sort of John Wayne impersonation. And we're a third of a continent. We sound like different things in different places.
That's actually a great point in terms of branching off and talking a little bit about language and foreign language requirements in the country, what you had to do in order to prepare yourself for either a language that you had to learn or a language that you had to brush up on and become proficient in. So for Holly, Elizabeth, and Rue, I'd like to hear your comments on that, but also from Heather and Allison. Allison, in terms of what you're doing to learn Norwegian, and Heather, comments that you have as far as what Fulbright is looking for. I know it depends on country. As far as the language is required. So, Heather, we can start with you. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Okay, so Fulbright, the answer really is it depends on the country, because Fulbright is looking to maximally impact the student who goes. So you may find that some grants offer language training in advance, some grants do not. Some grants, so there's many variables that go into this, and I think the overarching goal is to maximize impact and set up the student for success. So there may be, sometimes there's some choices. If you go to Peru and you know Quechua or you know Spanish, maybe the population that you're going to choose to interview speaks only Quechua. You may want to reconsider that if you have Spanish skills or you need to kind of solve for that problem there and say, well, perhaps I'm going to use a translator. But you're always going to be thinking, regardless of what the country offers, realistically, you're going to be in another country. If you have no proficiency at all, and in some cases, that's absolutely fine. But you'll want to be thinking about your survival within that country and preparing, whether it's your conversation groups or auditing in the class, to at least get some basic understanding. And it's also just very polite to be able to greet people, ask where the restroom is. It's also a necessity. So you can do sort of things on your own or plan for that. And then if it is required in your country, you need to be talking now to one of your language professors to demonstrate your proficiency as it relates to your country that you want to go to.